Excellent person. It's hilarious. See the only person who's got it.
No, there's 76 people. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We are just getting ready to start, so we're going to give maybe about 1 more minute or so before we begin. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Inaudi Esposito. I'm the Executive Director for the Orange County Human Rights Commission, and I use the pronouns she, her, and ella. The mission of the Orange County Human Rights Commission is to work towards bringing people together and provide education and awareness around issues affecting oppressed communities, especially during these times where our country is in turmoil over social injustices. The Commission is committed to continue to bring attention to issues like anti-Semitism and help provide resources for healing and action. Today is the first of our conversation on building understanding, anti-Semitism, and Curious Joel, and we are really excited to be able to partner with the Jewish Federation of Greater Orange County to have this really excellent conversation today. Moderating with me today is Rabbi Rachel Rubenstein, Executive Director of the Jewish Federation. Rabbi Rachel, would you please introduce yourself and the agency?
Thank you, Inaudi. My name is Rabbi Rachel Rubenstein. I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Orange County. And since 1977, the Jewish Federation of Greater Orange County has been working to build a strong Jewish community that enriches people's lives, helps those in need, and embraces all Jewish families. With member support, our recipient organizations in Orange County help thousands of people here at home and through the Jewish Federations of North America, aid Jewish communities at risk in Israel and around the world. The Zahor Anti-Semitism Initiative is a program of the Jewish Federation that works to combat anti-Semitism and hatred, working in schools, with community leaders, with local and county governments, and with the broader public to educate and to advocate toward creating a safer Orange County for all. And Nadia, I will turn it back to you to.
Absolutely. So before we get to hear from our amazing speakers, we just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. So the first thing is you'll notice we are on webinar mode, so we don't see your faces, your screens, your videos are off, and you also do not have the capacity to turn your mute off as well. However, we do encourage questions, so please go ahead, and if you have a question throughout the presentation, you can enter it using the Q&A option, which is highlighted on the bottom there in yellow. And at the end of the presentation, we will have an opportunity to ask questions. And we will take all the questions from the Q&A section. The other thing is that this webinar is being recorded, so just so that everybody is informed, and we will be able to share this video at the end of the presentation with everyone. So Rachel, if you can please introduce our speakers and we will get started right away.
Thank you. It is truly my pleasure to welcome David N. Myers, who is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He is the author or editor of 15 books in the field of Jewish history, including a forthcoming book with Nomi Stalzenberg on the Satmar Hasidic community of Kiryas Joel, New York. Myers also serves as the president of the New Israel Fund. We also have with us Nomi M. Stalzenberg, who holds the Nathan and Lily Chappell Chair at the USC Gould School of Law. A summa cum laude graduate of Yale University and a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, Stalzenberg was an editor on the Harvard Law Review and clerked for Judge John J. Gibbons of the U.S. Court of Appeals Third Circuit prior to joining USC Gould School of Law. Her academic research spans a range of interdisciplinary interests, including law and religion, cultural pluralism, law and liberalism, law and feminism, and law and literature. A strong proponent of multidisciplinary research and teaching, she helped establish the USC Center for Law, History, and Culture, which involves scholars and students from throughout USC's campus. She also serves on the advisory board of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Ethnic and Religious Diversity. She is also a member of the board of the Habonim Dror Foundation. Salzenberg's scholarly publications and writings on law and religion include the widely cited He Drew a Circle That Shut Me Out, Assimilation, Indoctrination, and the Paradox of a Liberal Education from the Harvard Law Review, The Profanity of Law in Law and the Sacred, Stanford University Press, and Writing the Relationship Between Race and Religion in Law in Oxford Journal of Legal Studies. More recent works focus on issues of religious accommodation, It's About Money, The Fundamental Contradiction of Hobby Lobby, and political theology with a difference, and is there such a thing as non-state law, lessons from Kiryas Joel. We are so excited and honored to welcome Drs. Myers and Salzenberg with us today.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Rubenstein, and thank you to the Jewish Federation of Orange County, as well as Inaude Esposito of the Orange County Human Rights Commission. We're really delighted to be here with you today. And we want to wish all of you who are celebrating the Jewish New Year, Shana Tova, Nagamar Chatima Tova. The subject of Kiryas Joel and anti-Semitism is almost always a topical one, but I would say more so now. And so why is that? Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed a wave of conspiracy theories in which Jews are blamed for instigating the virus. The Satmar Hasidim of Kiryas Joel are convenient targets because they are mysterious and alien to many people, including some of their closest physical neighbors. So if you put these two topics together, Kiryas Joel and anti-Semitism, you'll see that it's a very tricky matter. And indeed, there's a range of perspectives on the relationship between Kiryas Joel and anti-Semitism that one can identify. I can think of at least four positions. So first, there's a position of overt anti-Semitism based on a dislike of Jews and of some of the qualities attributed to Satmar Hasidim: clannishness, insularity, caring only for their own. Second, there's an anti-Semitism in effect, if not intent, in which people unwittingly absorb anti-Semitic stereotypes, including some of those I just mentioned about Satmar Hasidim. Third, there's criticism of the community that neither relies on anti-Semitic motifs nor ill will, nor is it focused on personal characteristics, but rather on actions and behavior. And then fourth, on the other end of the spectrum, there's a kind of apologetic and instinctual defense of every action of the community and its leaders. And I would suggest to you that there are in fact many positions in between. Nomi and I come to you today not to adjudicate, not to give grades, not to tell you which is the correct perspective. We want to try to help you understand a bit more the contexts out of which Satmar Hasidim came in order to grasp better how people in your community in Orange County can live together in a more harmonious fashion. And we're going to focus on two contexts which reflect our respective scholarly interests and which really rely on 15 years of research that are now culminating in a long overdue book called American Shtetl: Politics, Law, Conflict, and the Making of Kiryas Joel, New York, that will be coming out in 2021 from the Princeton University Press. So the two perspectives are Jewish history. I'm a scholar whose work lies in the field of Jewish history, in which the story of Kiryas Joel is in fact quite distinctive. And American law and culture, in which the story of Kiryas Joel is counterintuitively quite familiar. How is that so? Isn't KJ's, Kiryas Joel's, hyper-communalism at odds with America's hyper-individualism? And the answer is yes and no. There is a hyper-individualist libertarian strain that all of us can identify in American culture and political thought, but there's also a deeply communitarian spirit, one that values especially strong forms of religious sub-communities. And the roots of this extend back to the first European settlers to make their way to Plymouth Rock. And the tradition extends through the First Great Awakening in New England to the Second Great Awakening in the state of New York, to the Midwest, and culminating, we might say, in the state of Utah, which became the home of the Mormon Church. So Naomi is going to focus on the Americanist part of the story in just a bit. I want to begin my presentation, my part of the presentation, by trying to answer three questions. Who are the Satmar Hasidim of Kiryas Joel? What do they stand for? And what's going on today in terms of the COVID crisis? So let me begin with the first question. Who are they? And I'm going to answer in telegraphic fashion by focusing on 6 dates, more or less. 1887, the year of the birth of Joel Teitelbaum in Sziget, Hungary, in the twilight of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Joel Teitelbaum was born to a strictly Orthodox family that we call today Haredi, meaning one who trembles before God. And the area in which he was born, in the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the main laboratory for Haredi Judaism in its time. And Joel Teitelbaum and his family were classic representatives of that form of very stringent and even combative traditional observant Judaism. He served as a rabbi in a variety of places in this area of northeast Hungary before making his way in 1934 to a small city called Satmar. Or actually, when he made his way there in 1934, having been elected town rabbi 6 years earlier, it was by then called Satu Mare, because after the First World War, the town actually changed from being Hungarian to Romanian, and so too the name of the town changed. Joel Teitelbaum served there for 10 years until the Nazi invasion of that area in 1944, which by that point had actually reverted back to Hungary in 1940. And after the Nazi invasion in March 1944, most of Joel Teitelbaum's community in Satu Mare and surrounding areas was deported to Auschwitz. He, however, survived in very interesting circumstances, made his way to Switzerland and then Palestine before coming to the United States in 1946, our second date. In fact, on Rosh Hashanah, so around this time of year. And there, he set out to begin rebuilding his decimated community, not in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood of Brooklyn called Williamsburg. But all the while, he really harbored the hope of creating, in addition to Williamsburg, a suburban enclave at a remove from the allures and seductions of the city. And this process of finding the appropriate place took decades, because along the way, his representatives encountered anti-Semitism as they tried to buy land. And it turned out people didn't want to sell land to those who were strangely dressed in their view. Finally, in the early 1970s, Rabbi Teitelbaum's representatives succeeded in purchasing land in the town of Monroe in Orange County. And in 1974, the first Satmar settlers moved out from Brooklyn. And 3 years later, after protracted and bitter tensions with neighbors in the town of Monroe, the village of Kiryas Joel was officially created. Shortly after that, 2 years later, in 1979, Joel Teitelbaum dies, and that sets off an intense succession battle over leadership of the Satmar community that has really not ended to this day. His immediate successor was his nephew, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, who did not command the charismatic authority that his uncle possessed. And in 1999, our next major date, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum decided to split the Satmar Empire, which included not just Williamsburg and Kiryas Joel, but many other cities around the world. Rabbi Aaron, his eldest, and Rabbi Zalman Leib, his third, as heirs apparent. This set off major tensions between followers of the two students that, to a certain extent, exist to this day, really became enshrined in separate sets of institutions within the Satmar world. Now, meanwhile, there were very considerable external tensions between Kiryas Joel and its surrounding neighbors, especially as the community expanded quite dramatically from its inception in 1977. And we look at some of the demographic figures, you can see that dramatic growth. So in 1977, there were 500 residents of Kiryas Joel. In 1980, there were 2,000 or so. In the 1990 census, there are about 7,500 residents. In 2000, 13,000. In 2010, 20,000. And today, there are probably close to 27,000 residents of Kiryas Joel. So you can see that meteoric growth that required substantial resources. The three most important of which may well be land, water, and sewage capacity. The tensions over these resources and over the growth of the community persisted for decades and ultimately led to the decision by village leaders to leave behind, to secede from the town of Monroe and create in 2019 a self-standing town, no longer a village, a town of Palm Tree, which is the English translation for the Yiddish Teitelbaum, or palm tree. So I've answered more or less who they are, and now I want to just very briefly touch upon what they stand for. First, Satmar Hasidim stand for preserving tradition. There's a recurrent phrase in Satmar lore that captures this sensibility. It's a Hebrew term, Derech Yisrael Sava, following the path of the ancient Israel, of Jacob the elder. It means it is an absolute moral and spiritual imperative to heed the laws and commandments of the Jewish tradition as interpreted by religious leaders who have a position of absolute spiritual authority, particularly the Rebbe, the chief rabbi of the community. Second, the imperative of maintaining communal and family integrity. It's a value to remain within the community and to discourage outside penetration, both in terms of people and values. All the more so after the Holocaust. There's that sense of the moral urgency in preserving the community and building up within was accentuated dramatically after the Holocaust. The Satmar community suffered grievous losses, and there was a sense of an obligation to revivify, to rejuvenate the community. Along with those two principles is a third, I would say, respect for the political regime of the country, based on an ancient Jewish principle known as Dina di Malchuta, or Dina di Malchusa Dina. The law of the kingdom is the law. This is a general principle for traditionally observant communities, but even more accentuated, I would say, in the case of Satmar Hasidim, for whom America is not just one in another series of Gentile nations, but it really is a Malchus Shel Chesed. It is a regime of grace and kindness, which they believe bestowed upon them the beneficence of this country in accepting them in such a debilitated state after the Holocaust. Satmar Hasidim know that America was founded on religious freedom and that the First Amendment calls for the free exercise of religion. And they base their existence in this country and in Kiryas Joel on those principles. Critics point out that the First Amendment also prohibits state establishment of religion. And they point, not incorrectly, to Kiryas Joel as an example of a place where the boundary between religion and state is somewhat blurred. Not necessarily in a formal sense, because there is a religious establishment and a political establishment, but in many informal ways. All of this is to say that the story is complicated. KJ, Kiryas Joel, is both an outlier from the American norm in many ways, and it fits squarely into some of America's central and guiding political traditions. Now, to conclude my piece before I hand things over to Nomi, I want to say a word about how KJ responded to COVID. And here I'll focus on two bookend dates. One, March 18th, 2020. That was the date in which a number of Haredi leaders, including Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum, were summoned to a conversation with White House liaison to the Jewish community, Avi Berkowitz, and called upon to close down all institutions, schools, synagogues, shuls, other public institutions, public religious institutions, in the face of the growing pandemic. Rabbi Teitelbaum agreed, and on that day, the community sent out communications to the effect that all such institutions were closed down. I should add, 2 days before, I believe, Governor Cuomo closed down the state of New York. But significantly, 9 days after the Jewish holiday of Purim, when many Satmar Hasidim congregated, just as the virus was spreading, but before calls for quarantining and close downs were made. So that's the first date. I want to focus on March 18th. 6 months later, September 17th, just 5 days ago or so, when Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum heeded the advice of various Haredi leaders and his own local medical corps, the Hatzalah, not to go to Williamsburg as he traditionally did for Rosh Hashanah, and thereby to model the kind of restraint that it seemed was necessary to contain the virus. Now, between those two dates, 6 months apart, there has been lesser and greater adherence to the norms of quarantining and social distancing. And here I have to say that I rely, as does Nomi, chiefly on what we've read from the press, from the great Times Herald reporter, Times Herald record reporter Chris McKenna, who has been such an invaluable source for us, and from what we've heard from KJ friends, because I have not been to KJ myself since the COVID pandemic broke out. So for example, in May, we read that a KJ school was shut down when hundreds of students were found inside. I know from speaking to people in the community that ritual functions, daily prayers, weddings, bar mitzvahs continued to take place after the March 18th shutdown, albeit in smaller numbers than usual. There has been indeed congregating in KJ in larger numbers than elsewhere in surrounding communities. And at the same time, I want to point out that the number of COVID-19 cases in KJ is not disproportionate to other cities of its size in Orange County. So according to the most recent statistics, I think KJ is fourth in the county in numbers of COVID cases after Newburgh, Middletown, and Wallkill, all of which have basically the same number of residents. So does this mean that I condone the behavior of Satmar Hasidim and their leadership during the corona crisis? Well, as I've written elsewhere, I wish the leaders of the community in KJ and Williamsburg were more proactive and less reactive. I wish that fewer people had a kind of magical belief in the virtues of herd immunity, because in fact, a lot of people in KJ have had COVID. I wish there were more universal recognition in KJ and in the Haredi world about the ongoing dangers of large assemblies of people, even for what are deemed to be essential ritual purposes. At the same time, when you look at the rate of infection, it seems to me that there has been an exaggeration in regarding KJ as a uniquely dangerous den of super spreaders. I think there's also a lack of appreciation for how central prayer and coming together as a group are for the community. Indeed, this is, in a certain sense, an indication of how American they are in the tradition of strong forms of American religion. To the fact that hundreds of KJ residents have given plasma to help others ward off COVID. So all of this is again to say that this is a tricky matter, and we must be cautious when we put together these two topics of Kiryas Joel. KJ may look and sound different, and indeed is in many ways, but it is inextricably part of America at the same time. I'll hand things over to Nomi now.
Hello, everyone. I want to add my voice of thanks to the organizers and also to all of you for attending and participating in this discussion. I'm going to, which is the Americanness of Kiryas Joel and the way it really partakes of broader currents in American society. And I'm going to do so by focusing on 3 particular sites of controversy that have been breeding grounds maybe for anti-Semitism. I don't think we can rule that possibility out. Or certainly for suspicions of anti-Semitism forming. And part of the difficulty, of course, is it can be very difficult to separate those 2 things out. When is a perception of anti-Semitism a misunderstanding of criticisms of the community that are not, as David said earlier in his presentation, either anti-Semitic in intent or in effect, and when are they consciously or unwittingly conduits for pretty ancient anti-Semitic tropes. So the 3 sites I'm going to refer to, and we'll immediately see how American this story is, are number 1, housing. Controversies over housing, and even in the absence of controversy, what are the resources, the material and legal resources in the United States that have granted, that have enabled the Satmars to gain access to housing and the particular form that their housing takes. Number 2, schools, and more particularly public schools. And number 3, public health. So to truncate very long and complex stories, to begin with housing, there are actually 2 aspects to that story. One is the way in which the creation of Kiryas Yoel and its ongoing existence has been part of the larger story of what critics of the phenomenon refer to as exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning being the term that is used to refer to the kinds of zoning regulations that are typical of American suburbs, and that serve on the one hand to maintain a certain kind of community character, and on the other hand to keep others out. So there's an exclusionary zoning narrative that is very much part of the creation story of Kiryas Yoel. And then there's also a public housing narrative. So very quickly, when even before the Satmars established the community of Kiryas Yoel, they make several attempts to acquire land elsewhere in the New York and New Jersey suburbs. And those plans are thwarted. Part of the reason they ended up in the town of Monroe is because established communities and suburbs that they sought to enter successfully prevented the Satmars from buying property. They were not welcome. Now, was the desire to keep the Satmars out an instance of rank anti-Semitism? Maybe. Was it the reflection of a more benign motive to maintain the values of their community that they perceived, not necessarily inaccurately, would be eroded and changed? Can we divorce these 2 things? That's hard to say. But the important point here is that certainly at the beginning of the history of Kiryas Yoel, we see the Satmars are positioned as the objects of exclusion. They are the outsiders that are being kept out. And so too, even though they succeeded in acquiring property in the town of Monroe, and in order to succeed, they actually had to engage in a ruse of getting an unbearded man who wouldn't be suspected of being a chassid to function as the purchasing agent. Once the townspeople of Monroe realized who really was going to be developing the community and who really was going to be occupying the new property developments. A very ferocious, but in many ways very typical fight broke out over the enforcement of zoning and building ordinances. And at the heart of the problem lay the fact that although this is a suburban community, the Satmars, because of their very large families, because of the fact that most households are people do not have a lot of economic means. There's a preference for the kind of high density housing, multi-unit housing, that is precisely what the typical exclusionary zoning ordinance in a typical suburb excludes. And the fact that suburbs do so, when the people who are being kept out are the poor or simply the less affluent, and of course that very commonly correlates with the not white. We usually, or the liberal position is to regard that as the use of exclusionary zoning as highly problematic, as violating central liberal principles of equality, and our sympathies lie with the excluded. Well, in this phase of the story, the Satmars are in the position of the excluded. They're the ones who are being kept out. And the secession of the village of Kiryas Yol from the larger township of Monroe was precisely an attempt, as it turned out, a very successful attempt to avoid being the victims of exclusionary zoning. So there we see the Satmars are occupying the position of the excluded other, the discriminated against minority, the position more typically filled by non-white and or non-affluent minority communities. At the same time that this was going on, indeed preceding the exodus of Satmars from Williamsburg into the suburbs and into the town of Monroe, there was another fight, again over housing, that was taking place in Brooklyn. I mentioned that, and I'm sure it's well known to many of you, that there's a very high level of poverty in the community. That goes hand in hand with a very widespread reliance on public housing. So whereas in the suburbs, in Monroe, in Kiryas Yol, the Satmar community faced off against and locked horns with a predominantly white community over housing. In the city, in Brooklyn, the community was locking horns with their neighbors who were predominantly Black and Puerto Rican. And this led to a many decades long housing discrimination lawsuit in which Black and Puerto Rican residents of the neighborhood sued the city, claiming that it was unfairly preferring the Hasidic community, of which the Satmars were the largest component, in the allocation of housing. So we see the complexities. Sometimes that the Satmars are occupying the position of the excluded minority, and other times they're rightly or wrongly perceived as being the excluder. The latter is perhaps part of the story of the becoming white of Jews. And the point I want to close out here before turning to the second site, which is controversies over public schools, is how difficult it is to assess the validity of claims, either that the Satmars are being the victims of anti-Semitism, or we oftentimes hear, especially amongst Jews, the anxious concern that the behavior of the Satmars is going to lead to anti-Semitism. In both of these contexts, I think is really hard to say, right? So if we take the Brooklyn situation, there's little doubt that when the Satmars first arrived, I don't want to overstate it by saying they were entirely innocent of racism, but certainly the distinctively American brand of racism was not really part of the worldview of the Satmars. The Satmars' worldview was anyone who's not a Satmar is someone to keep away from and someone to separate themselves from. In Brooklyn, that included and was that the outsiders from which they sought to withdraw were predominantly Black and Puerto Rican. Did that lead to did the Black and Latino communities who felt that the Satmars were being preferred in the allocation of public housing become anti-Semitic in response? Did Satmars develop racist attitudes towards Blacks and Puerto Ricans in response? Again, it's really impossible to tease those things out. I think it's likely that both communities might have developed and sort of acquired anti-Semitic and racist attitudes vis-a-vis one another. I think it's equally plausible that many members of both of those communities, even when they had objections against one another, those objections need not be reduced to either anti-Semitism and racism on either part. We see similar sort of ambiguities in the controversies over public schools that arose after Kiryas Yol was formed. And here I want to point out, and you all are locals and are probably very up to speed on these nuances, but when I'm out and about, I find that very often the village of Kiryas Yol and its public school controversy is conflated or equated with the East Ramapo community, which is another community that has a very large Hasidic and Haredi population, and that had its own public school controversy. No doubt most of you are familiar with both of them. The point I want to make here is that while these two situations are oftentimes conflated, at a certain level, they actually respect precisely opposite approaches. What happened in East Ramapo and what makes East Ramapo different from the village of Kiryas Yol? First of all, East Ramapo is a demographically diverse community. It's a community that is not entirely populated by Hasidim or Haredim, let alone members of one particular Haredi group, the Satmars, which is the case in the village of Kiryas Yol. Rather, there are substantial communities of multiple different Haredi and Hasidic groups living in the same local jurisdiction as folks of entirely different backgrounds, white, Black, brown, many different income levels. For many, many years, as in Kiryas Yol, the Haredi Jews had no interest in the public school district. They paid their taxes as they were obligated to do, but they were not interested in sending their children to public schools because in our constitutional system, there's no religion in the public schools. If you want a religious education, as of course these communities do, you go to private school. The rub is special education. The rub is that in the mid-70s, one of the first victories of the disability rights movement, Congress passed a law mandating that every public school district provide individually tailored programs for children with special needs. And that every public school district owes to every child in its district, regardless of whether the child attends a public school. So the child could attend a private school, be it a parochial religious school or a non-religious private, on the part of the public school district to provide that publicly funded publicly provided by public employees, employees of the school district exists. Both in Kiryas Yol and in East Ramapo, parents of children with special needs had to contend with the dilemma which is faced by every religious community that wants to send their children to parochial schools. How can they get publicly funded special educational services provided to their children? Are they obliged to send their children to public school, right? And so in both of these communities, in Kiryas Yol, an entirely separate public school district was established by law so that children in Kiryas Yol could attend a public school, receive publicly funded special educational services without there being any concern that in doing so, the state and the local district were breaching the wall of separation between church and state. So a more perfect form of withdrawal, a separate public school district. In East Ramapo, the opposite strategy was used, which is the pejorative version of the narrative, is that the Hasidim and the Haredim took over the East Ramapo public school. That was a situation that undoubtedly led to an enormous amount of anti-Semitism in response to the perception that the Haredim had taken over the public school district, and the widespread perception was that they were diverting the financial resources of the public school district to unfairly prioritize the education of Hasidic children outside the public school district, and that they were starving the public schools and the children who attended the public schools, many of whom were Black and brown, in response. So there were both legitimate criticisms, some criticisms that were not entirely legitimate, that were based on a misunderstanding about the legal obligation, and one might say the moral obligation that the public school district had to provide special educational services to children who don't attend public school, and undoubtedly anti-Semitism. And on the flip side, right, did the Hasidic community become, or was it already, did it reveal racist attitudes in response? Again, these things, how do you say, right? But it seems quite likely that on both sides, there was a complicated and ambiguous mixture. I am not going to talk about the third site of controversy. I will just name it because I think it might be interesting juxtaposition with the current concerns over COVID. I said the third site, which predates our current COVID crisis, is controversies of public health. And here I'm thinking about the anti-vax movement and how that has manifested itself within Kiryas Yol. I'd be happy to address more about that. But I just want to finish with a couple of broader points, interrelated points. First of all, putting the anti-Semitism question aside for the moment, what I've sought to do is to, at least to a certain extent, de-exceptionalize Kiryas Yol. I mean, it is exceptional in many regards. But when we see how they fit into the narrative of exclusionary zoning, when we see how they fit into the narrative of fights over public housing, when we see how they fit into controversies over public schools, one of the things that what we see generally is how much the Satmars of Kiryas Yol partake of and in American culture, notwithstanding their determination and a quite astonishing degree of success in withdrawing from the larger society. So part of what we see in all of these instances is interactions that take place between the Satmar community and their neighbors around them. These interactions turn out to be unavoidable. But there's another, maybe deeper way in which the Satmars and their experience, and indeed the degree to which they succeed in separating themselves, in avoiding interactions with the outside world, is part and parcel of American culture. Because if you think about how were they able to acquire property once they had overcome the forces of exclusionary zoning, they were able to form an enclave in which every single contiguous piece of privately owned property is occupied by a Satmar through the very same forces, market forces, laws that protect and regulate the real estate market, that foster segregation of other kinds, that foster exclusionary zoning, that foster socioeconomic and racial segregation. The very same economic and legal regimes that enable white affluent communities to exist as enclaves, to a large extent separated from others, have enabled the formation of Kiryas Yol. So the last thing I will say is, I think that if insofar as people have a moral instinct to criticize the Satmars of Kiryas Yol for their separatism, if you will, for segregating themselves, for not feeling an obligation towards people outside their community. We have to ask ourselves, who of us isn't similarly, not entirely similarly to be sure, living with people like ourselves and apart from others, whether we measure that by race, by economic status, or by some other vector of identity. I think it causes us to revisit the much maligned contact hypothesis, right? The contact hypothesis was the view that prevailed in the now long ago era of Brown versus Board, which proposed that in the absence of contact between different groups, the lack of contact would foster bigotry, fear of the other, dislike, antipathy towards the other. The contact hypothesis has been largely repudiated, but I think that when we ponder and criticize the separatism of the Satmars of Kiryas Yol, we need to apply that critical perspective on residential and other forms of separation and segregation more broadly, and recognize how pervasive a feature of American society it is.
Thank you, and I think we are now ready to turn things over to Rachel for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Stolzenberg and Professor Myers, for that. That was really, really informative. So I will kick off the Q&A, and this is a really great time. If anybody has any questions for our presenters, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A. We do have a few that have lined up already. And the first question is, on what basis or around what common ethics could those outside the Kiryas Joel community begin conversation about better relations? I'm going to repeat it one more time. So on what basis or around what common ethics could those outside the Kiryas Joel community begin conversation about better relations?
Yeah, that's a very good a very good question to start off the conversation. Um, I believe that there is a shared desire on the part of residents of Kiryas Joel and the community's neighbors for the following: economic well-being, public health, the well-being of children, um, the importance of getting along with one's neighbors. Um, these are all actually principles deeply enshrined in the theological and political foundations of Haredi Judaism, of which Satmar Hasidim are perhaps the most prominent and largest branch. What I think is perhaps more important than identifying those values, because one can always find those values in the core texts of this or that tradition, is really the imperative of attempting to understand what the lived experience of the other looks like through the other's eyes. It's very easy to adopt a position of mocking condescension towards a community where it's not at all unusual for a family to have 10 or 15 children, which dwells statistically near or close to the poverty line, and which doesn't resemble in any discernible physical ways a typical suburban community. But some Hasidim choose to live the way they do for a very particular reason. So I think the first and most important praxis, I would say, is not to identify, at least in my view, a list of common values, but to try to understand the other through the other's eyes. I spend a lot of time thinking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and there too, I'm mindful of the towering psychological and rhetorical walls that separate the two groups. And I think what I would counsel first is a measure of empathy and understanding what the lived experience looks like. So Satmar Hasidim are trying to preserve a way of life that was almost extinguished in 1944-45. And they do so with a sense of extraordinary devotion to their religious principles and to their creator. They also believe very strongly in the principles of loyalty and patriotism to their home country. And so I think there needs to be, a kind of climbing over or perhaps tearing down of the psychological and rhetorical walls. And it needs to go the other way as well. As committed as Kiryas Joel is to communal integrity, enabled by that degree of insularity that we all know, it's important that in a kind of conscious way, members of the community seek to understand what things look like to neighbors who feel this constant sense of encroachment, this constant appetite for resources that are deeply valuable. This sort of kind of ruptured understanding what the value of the natural environment is, and that's going to that kind of mutual act of empathy is going to require really moving out of one's comfort zone. And so I think that's actually more important as a praxis, as a practice, than identifying 3 or 5 set of shared values. It's going to require, that kind of move requires leadership. It requires a degree of openness with which the Satmar community feels uncomfortable. Also requires a degree of openness on the part of neighbors to understand a little bit better. Although it's not my job to hire such people, I think there still could be a better public relations within the village of Kiryas Joel in sort of making clear why KJ is an essential part of Orange County and its residents key stakeholders in the county's well-being.
We should take another question.
Thank you so much. Our next question addresses the distinction between anti-Semitism and addressing bad behavior or bad neighbors. It asks, if the Satmar community is exploiting loopholes in laws to avoid fair tax assessment, is there a way to address concerns about that behavior without being anti-Semitic?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is. Here, I think, although the question of defining anti-Semitism is a very tricky proposition, I think the easy answer is do not attribute any personal or group characteristics to the actors, as if they are motivated to behave badly by virtue of their being Jewish or Hasidic or clannish. Focus on the actions and the behavior. It is certainly the case that some within the community will say any criticism of behavior is in essence a criticism on the way of life of the community and therefore a criticism of their very being. And that's where Nomi Stolzenberg has done the thought really long and hard about the need to distinguish between disagreement and discrimination. Maybe she can say a word about that.
Yeah. I mean, this is really, really hard because they're both questions of definition and questions of fact, right? So at the definitional level, I think it is absolutely possible and necessary to distinguish criticism of the behavior of a group and disagreement with their practices from discrimination against the group, right? I mean, we cannot just simply reduce the former to the latter and say anytime someone disagrees with the behavior of a religious group or a group defined by some other shared characteristic, that's discriminating against them. That makes no sense. But in any particular case, it's hard to distinguish the two. First of all, just as a, take the example that was given, right? Is the behavior, the bad behavior of which the Satmars or any other group are being accused, is that allegation valid, right? Is it, that's a question of fact. Are the Satmars on a widespread basis, evading fair tax assessments? It's possible that the perception that they are is distorted or inaccurate. And insofar as it is, it's possible that the distortion is reflection of some preconceived, maybe unconscious, maybe anti-Semitic or maybe not anti-Semitic, but some other kind of suspicion that, so there are many instances in which, people assert that it's just a fact, welfare fraud is rampant and this kind of fraud is rampant. And not to say that there aren't instances of welfare fraud, but is it more, oftentimes, so just the facts, the sheer facts can be very difficult to establish. Even more so is the fact of whether criticism is motivated by valid disagreements, which I've said at the level of principle and definition must be distinguished from discrimination against the group that's being discriminated or not. And what makes it even more difficult is these things are dynamic, right? So to take the example of the public housing controversy in Brooklyn that I mentioned. I do not know what the facts of the matter were at any point in historical time, but I can imagine, painting the story in perhaps overly broad strokes. I can imagine that at the beginning of the controversy, let's just say for the sake of argument, that the Black and Latino neighbors who were seeking units in the same public housing buildings as the Satmars were, let's just posit that they were innocent of anti-Semitism. They were not anti-Semites. Let's just, and let's posit that the Satmars were not racist. They had just gotten off the boat from Europe. They didn't know, but let's just even if that is true, and surely that has to be a kind of overgeneralization and oversimplification, and even if in the first instance, each side simply had legitimate complaints against and disagreements with one another that were based on their behavior, not based on the kinds of attributions of negative beliefs about you're a this because you're a Jew, or you're a that because you're Black. It would be hard, especially for people living in the wider context of the United States of America, where racism is ambient in the culture. And anti-Semitism is, to a lesser extent, true. It would be surprising if Satmars, who might have been completely innocent of racism towards Blacks, it would be unsurprising if in the context of their legal fight over public housing, they came to absorb American-style racism, and vice versa, right? So these things are dynamic, and figuring out what is actually the case and when is a suspicion that the Satmars are racist or critics of the Satmars are anti-Semitic, when is that valid and when is that invalid? I don't think we have the tools to do a good job of sorting that out. All we can do is be aware of all of the range of possibilities and the need to not conflate these distinct phenomena.
Thank you. The next question is, in the US, the law of the land says you can't discriminate in housing, yet KJ allows only Jews to live there. How is this not unconstitutional?
Okay, that is a really core key, goes right to the heart of the matter question, but it turns out to be very complicated. We need to unpack it. So the way the question is formulated, how is it possible that KJ, how is it phrased? KJ, doesn't allow Jews not. Well, what is KJ, right? KJ might mean the municipality, right? There's, the village of Kiryas Yol is an officially recognized local government. So imagine a scenario in which the village of Kiryas Yol passed an ordinance saying only no Satmars, no non-Satmars can live here. Now, no such thing has happened. Would that be unconstitutional? Absolutely, right? In 1918, the Supreme Court addressed the constitutionality of a racially restrictive zoning ordinance. It used to be commonplace for municipalities to explicitly, there was no subterfuge, it was completely blatant. Whites only can live here by law, right? It actually took a long time. It wasn't until 1918 that the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. For a local government to legislate on the basis of race or religion who can live within the jurisdiction, that is unconstitutional. But that hasn't occurred. The village of Kiryas Yol, no official legal governmental entity of the village is engaged in exclusion. What happened, to go to the race analogy, after the Supreme Court held that racially restrictive zoning is unconstitutional? Did racial segregation come to an end? Not at all. It's simply that the agent of exclusion was transferred from public entities like local governments to private entities like private property owners. And that's how we got racially restrictive covenants, and which are agreements amongst and between property owners that bind not only the people who enter into the agreement, but they bind any successive owner of the property subject to the agreement. It took, quite a number of decades, 3 more decades before the Supreme Court said, well, racially restrictive covenants are unconstitutional. And that remains a somewhat dubious holding to this day because of the deep-seated belief that the constitutional obligation not to exclude on the basis of race or religion, which is attributed to the Equal Protection Clause, applies only to state actors, whereas private individuals, right? If I only want to invite white people to my dinner party, the Constitution has nothing to say about that. And many people think by the same token, I as a private property owner, if I have a racial preference or a religious preference, that is not unconstitutional. Here again, we can sort of clarify the principles, and it's very important to clarify that insofar as non-SOTMers are being excluded, not allowed to live in the community, insofar as that's true, the agent of exclusion is primarily, if not exclusively, private property owners or private organizations. It's a little bit more complicated. There's some hazy, as David said, blurring of the boundaries between public and private that we could get into. I won't do that right now for the sake of time. But I have to say, right, the classic way, that's a question of fact. Are people, there's a question of law. Would it be unconstitutional for private entities to exclude non-SOTMers? Not at all clear that it is. Maybe it is. Insofar as it is, we do have fair housing laws that apply to private actors too. How do we know that's going on? We don't know if that is going on. And part of the reason we don't know is because, as far as I know, and we really tried to find out, no non-SOTMers have sought to buy into the community. So is KJ excluding non-SOTMers? It's not so clear.
Go try and buy it.
You could send in a tester and see what happens. That's the classic way to try to ferret out whether or not private discrimination on the basis of, usually it's race, but here we could ask about religion is going on. No one has sought to do that. It would be interesting to see, would the non-SOTMer person actually be refused? Would it turn out to be true, as a matter of fact, that a non-SOTMer is unable to buy or rent? And if it does turn out to be true, would the courts deem that to be, it wouldn't be deemed to be unconstitutional. It might be deemed to run afoul of the fair housing laws. But I don't think it's 100% clear, especially with our Supreme Court, that that's what the ultimate legal outcome would be. Maybe it should be. That's another debate. I could go on and on about these matters for a long time, but I'll stop. It's a very, very key question and complicated.
Thank you so much. Our next question is asking about, you had mentioned that this is a community that experiences high poverty, and it's asking about the driving forces behind the poverty that are experienced by that community.
Yeah, so I would say three things about that. First, indeed, there is a high poverty rate in Kiryas Yol. According to the most recent numbers, 46% of the community lives below the poverty line. Why is that? Well, first, the community very much values large families. So you may have a large family with a combined income of $60,000. That often is deemed, may well be deemed according to the federal guidelines to be at or near the poverty line, given the size of the family. So large families account for a substantial portion of it. The limited secular education reduces the array of vocational options open to people in the community. Very out of character, or I should say, very typical of the profile of American Jews and their aspirations in both educational and socioeconomic terms. So large families, limited secular education, very considerable religious education, and I would say, and a different set of priorities, a different value set. The value is not to go to the best college and get a high-paying job, as much as it is to spend a lifetime within the community, in a community committed to ritual observance, to study, and very much to communal self-help. So these are some of the reasons why the community really defies, certainly, the profile of much of the rest of the Jewish community in the United States. That's number one. Number two, the rate of poverty is going down rather considerably. I think in the last census, in the 2010 census, the figure was closer to 61%, which suggests that more Satmar Hasidim are being employed in higher paying jobs. It's not just a function of public support that pulls people out of poverty. In fact, what I've noticed is a kind of what we call bourgeoisement, a rising middle class, rising bourgeoisie in Kiryas Joel, as the array of economic options is expanding. One interesting example is third-party selling or reselling online on the internet, which actually doesn't require leaving the community, but does involve engagement with the world in a very different kind of way. And I should just add parenthetically that the internet is both a gateway to new economic prosperity and the source of a grave threat to the community, because it obliterates existing boundaries that the community very jealously guards. And that, I think, relates to a third point. So first point is families, different kind of education, different priorities. Second is, yes, high poverty rate, but declining owing to this process of embourgeoisement. Third is, we really see within the community, I think, a set of competing sensibilities, countervailing sensibilities. On one hand, and the internet is both an emblem and a causal agent in this, we see an ongoing process of what we call unwitting assimilation into America, into sort of the American mainstream. Free use of the internet is very, very seriously frowned upon within the community. It is deemed acceptable for purposes of economic sustainability, but free use of the internet is really meaning liberal, unrestrained use is regarded. But more and more people are surfing the net. More and more people actually do have smartphones. More and more people do make use of the internet at home. And that reflects what may be as neighbors. There is an ongoing process of what we call unwitting acculturation or assimilation. We see evidence of it in terms of the absorption by KJ leaders of the political culture of the United States. KJ leaders know how to play the game of American interest group politics as well as anyone. But we're also seeing it beginning to trickle down to residents who have access to the internet and to a wider world. What's the effect of that unwitting assimilation? Well, when it becomes witting, or when it becomes known to the religious leaders of the community, the impulse is to refortify the boundaries. And so we have these two competing impulses. We have this ongoing process of ongoing assimilation, in a sense, Americanization, and we have a redrawing of the boundaries, a reinforcement of the boundaries. And there's a very interesting clash between those two impulses within the community. As part of that ongoing process of unwitting assimilation, the poverty level has dropped and the quality of life has gone up for many residents in the town.
Thank you. The next question is around the narrative that there were more COVID cases in KJ because they did not socially distance. Can you speak to any data that you may have or any validity in the folks in Kiryas Joel not socially distancing or having higher cases than everywhere else in the community?
It may be that the two things are true, that there was less social distancing and that the number of cases was not wildly disproportionate. Anecdotally, I know of stories of friends of mine who said, people are still, there's a call to shut things down. But I'm looking at what I think is the Orange County website, which Orange County, New York COVID-19 cases by town, which was updated on the 21st of September, which you can probably get to through Orange County. I'm looking at it through coronavirus-resources.esri.com, which lists, they give lie to the claim that there's a disproportionate number of cases. How we can countenance these two, I'm not really sure. As I said, I've not been in the community since the COVID outbreak, so I don't know, but I am looking at the Orange County website. Could there be underreporting? Sure. Could it be the case that, in fact, there is some measure of herd immunity in Kirstjol, that especially given the youth of the population, there's a much higher proportion of COVID that had relatively minimal deleterious health effects? It is indeed possible, but I'll leave it for the doctors amongst you to address that more fully.
Thank you. Professor Myers, you spoke a little bit in your history and your short history recap about the division between the two sects within the Satmar community. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, where we find that in Palm Tree and in Kiryas Joel, the differences in ideology, the difference in attitude, whatever differences you see in terms of their relation to the general community of Orange County between the different sects within the Satmar community.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. So as I mentioned, in 1999, in a stunning decision, Reb Moshe Teitelbaum, the second Satmar Rebbe, decided basically to divide the Satmar world, the Satmar Empire. It was assumed that he would hand over the reins of the kingdom to his eldest son, Reb Aaron, whom he appointed chief rabbi of Kiryas Joel in 1984. The decision in 1999 quickly set in place factions that once upon a time used to be represented in the divide between Kiryas Joel, where Rabbi Aaron was based, and Williamsburg, where his younger brother, Rabbi Zalman Leib, was located. And therein lay the source of chief difference, with a small number of supporters of Reb Zalman. I should say that the tension was exacerbated 7 years later when Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum died, thereby leaving the two brothers to, in a sense, fight it out over control of the Satmar Empire. And indeed they did so. And in that period, really from 1999 until maybe 2010, tensions were often fierce between the two. It was as if they were two competing sects that would not have anything to do with one another. They wouldn't go to the same simchas, have social interaction with one another. They wouldn't allow marriages between the two. What this did was to create two sets of institutions, or moistus, as they say in Satmar lore, institutions, including schools, wedding halls, mikvahs, ritual bathhouses, study halls, yeshivas, the whole array of educational and religious institutions. Once upon a time, the divide was between Brooklyn and Williamsburg, but over time, more followers of Rabbi Zalman Leib have come to dwell in Kiryas Joel, or have really come out of the woodworks, as it were. And so now you have multiple circles of Satmar Hasidim in Kiryas Joel itself. Now, there's one important point to mention, and that is that the followers of Zalman Leib in KJ, who really have no substantial theological difference with the followers of Rabbi Aaron, connected with, linked up with a smaller group of dissidents who appeared just after Rabbi Moses Teitelbaum was appointed to succeed his uncle, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. I'm sorry if this is getting too complicated to follow, but why was that the case? A small number of people believe that Rabbi Moses Teitelbaum wasn't worthy, Moshe Teitelbaum wasn't worthy of succeeding Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, including, it seems, the widow of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, known as Alta Feiga, who gathered around her a group of dissidents who were seriously marginalized by the new regime of Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum. That small group of dissidents connected, for reasons of political alliance, with the followers of Rabbi Zalman Leib. They didn't necessarily merge entirely within them, but for the purposes of fighting the heavy-handed, what they perceived to be the heavy-handed authority of Rabbi Aaron, they joined forces. Ultimately, they would go on to create their own set of moistus, their own set of institutions. So you have in Kiryas Joel today, which seems to be the picture of uniformity, in fact, three distinct communities, three distinct sets of institutions. That associated with Rabbi Aaron, the majority, that associated with Rabbi Zalman Leib, and that group of dissidents now known as the B'nai Yoel, the sons of Joel, who remain in a certain sense the truest, most ardent believers of the teaching of the first Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. It is the case that differences remain between them, largely in the way they approach the outside world, whereas Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum is the establishment in both religious and political terms, and thus adopts a position of kind of resistance to the outside world, or I should say, adopts a position of no surrender when resistance is expressed on the part of surrounding neighbors to KJ's attempts at expansion. The other two factions tend to ally with their external neighbors, based on that principle of the law of the land is the law, dina di machusa dina. So, for example, some of those from the distant world formed something called the Kiryas Joel Alliance, which became the partner of United Monroe in a variety of conflicts with the KJ establishment. Ultimately, the KJ establishment associated with Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum actually was the body that entered into the negotiations with United Monroe to create the new town of Palm Tree. So it sort of bypassed that alliance between the KJ Alliance and United Monroe. But it's important to note there are three groups within. The differences between them are minimal theologically and declining in terms of social differentiation.
But this really goes back to the question that was raised earlier, although it seems unrelated. What potential is there for finding common ground between the Satmars and their neighbors? And so David's first crack of the question was kind of abstract and hypothetical. You know, we could identify shared values around which, solidarity could form. In point of fact, as David just said, political alliances and I think not merely political forms of solidarity have formed between this one segment, the dissident segment of the community, which is nearly co-equal in size to the non-dissident, and the outside. Now you could see that very cynically as it's just, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But even if it were the case that the original motivating factor behind the creation of this alliance was purely strategic, and we're gonna the internal opposition to the K establishment is going to join forces with the external opposition. And even if it began that way, the rhetoric is totally a rhetoric of good neighbors. It's a rhetoric of contrary to popular or unpopular perception, it is not true that we are indifferent to the welfare of our neighbors. We care, we extend, it's a very good neighbors rhetoric. And I have little doubt that even if that was adopted initially for purely strategic reasons, it becomes incorporated. So I think there is a genuine commitment to the ethos of neighborliness that has developed, but out of this kind of triangulated situation. Power dynamics.
I just want to say, we may need to wrap up soon, I don't know, but I could not let the opportunity pass, especially as I gave that very tortured answer with many different paths, to thank the extraordinary ASL translators who are working this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. We do have to wrap up. We're down to the wire. We have 2 minutes left, and 14 questions that were unaddressed. So we really do thank everybody for asking your questions, and thank the professors for giving us such a wealth of information. We're hoping to squeeze one more in there if we can in under 2 minutes. The question is around the growth of KJ in the upcoming years. How do you see this growth impacting the relationship between the neighboring communities over the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, so over the last major annexation battle of beginning, I think, in 2013, that culminated in the creation of the town of Palm Tree, there were various estimates undertaken of population growth. According to one estimate, I think that produced by KJ itself, the estimate was that by 2035, there would be 75,000 residents of Kiryas Joel. That's one estimate. It's clear to me that the community will continue to grow at a very, very rapid rate. If you look at the demographic data from 1990, you can see that KJ continues to grow at a rapid rate, but declining rate as well. But it's going to continue to grow. Satmar Hasidim are not going to have small families. I will say that as part of that process of unwitting assimilation, it's not unlikely that birth rates will decline, not to the numbers of the typical nuclear white American family or suburban family in the area. But they're going to continue to be big families, and a need to grow and to house newly married couples and the children they bring into the world, which I think just lays out with urgency the important work of the Human Rights Commission and other such bodies to really facilitate that conversation and to push and cajole both sides to look beyond those rhetorical and psychological walls and try to understand what life looks like through the eyes of the other. I think that's going to be the great challenge of the next decade, and I'm happy to, Nomi and I are happy to give any help we can in facilitating that conversation. It's really going to be critical to the well-being of Orange County at large.
Thank you. Professor Staldenberg, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, I will reiterate what David said. I think the exponential growth and the scale that has now been attained and it will soon be surpassed, I think it changes everything. I think it changes everything on both sides, right? So number one, it makes the ability to separate from the wider world essentially impossible, because the fights over scarce resources, land, water, sewer pipes, that this will make continued engagement with, conflict with, but hopefully to be succeeded by ongoing negotiation with people outside the community. That's just going to become a constant. But also on the other side of the equation, the whole concept of religious accommodation is sort of imagined from the standpoint of American law as if we, mainstream society, can choose to or not to accommodate. It's always imagined as some small little community that it's not going to affect us. So that the fantasy of separation that's harbored by the Satmars, that they could perfectly separate themselves from the outside world, is matched by the fantasy that it is possible to tolerate and accommodate a group's separatism without it affecting the larger community. But as I've said, I think those are both fantasies. And the final thing that I think is a really interesting consequence of just the sheer size and scale that the community has attained is that even though, as appears to be the case, you see quite low rates of defection of people leaving the community, even a small percentage of such a big community, the so-called the ex-Hasidic community, the ex-Satmar community has attained a critical mass, and it has become a force to be reckoned with, an increasing part of the complicated political story of the village of Kiryas Yol in its own right.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Professors Myers and Selzenberg for learning with us today. We really learned so much from both of you, and it was, with the amount of questions we left unanswered, we'll have to bring you back to our community, maybe when your book is out, and we can celebrate with you and continue to learn together. So thank you so much for joining us. A huge thank you again, following Professor Myers, to our ASL interpreters. Thank you for joining us. And of course, thank you to our partners at the Orange County Human Rights Commission for partnering with us on this program. We're so grateful to your partnership. As you can see on the screen, if you would like more information about offerings from the Orange County Human Rights Commission, please reach out to Inaudi Esposito. Her email address is on the screen and will also be in a follow-up email. To learn about future offerings from the Jewish Federation, you can email myself. Again, my email will be in the follow-up email. And our next session will be a conversation with Inaudi Esposito and myself about anti-Semitism more generally in our community and what we can do to stand up against it. That will be on Thursday, October 8th at 7 p.m., again on Zoom. So I just want to thank everyone, the 100+ people who joined us live, and the many more who I know will be watching the recording. Thank you all so much, and I hope that everyone has a lovely rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.